Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.
Hello, everybody. As you know, this week we are doing exclusive interviews with very special guests, more in-depth interviews than our typical show, as I am on hiatus. Thank you for joining us for this show. I'm very excited. For the first time ever on the Nomiki Show, we have Caiendi Andrews, who is the author of The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. He's also a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University and the chair of the Harambee Organization of Black Unity. Thank you, Caiendi, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
So, colonialism is still a thing. Imperialism, colonialism. Before we get into just sort of the crux of what these all represent in the 21st century, can we just do some basic, I guess, definitions? I think we use these terms a lot in modern day, and we see them in memes. But basic definitions, like how would you define colonialism in 2021?
Well, I mean, colonialism is basically when one country or place controls another place, uses resources, drains out its resources, exploits it. Historically, that had been these European empires, like the British Empire or the Spanish Empire, who'd gone around conquering other parts of the world. Today, it looks a little bit different, where you have formal freedom in places of large parts of Africa, of Asia, etc. But that same relationship where the economics and the people are still exploited in order to make us rich, effectively. Us, and I say us, I mean us in Britain, us in the West. That's still there. And that's why I say colonialism is still very much here today.
Is colonialism today built off of the colonialism of the past? Or is this just a completely new form? I mean, people talk about technology and how technology is shaping a new economy, and there's colonialism technology. And it's also based off of previous colonialism, sort of, a Frankenstein version of it, I guess. But would you consider it sort of the foundations were, in being a New Yorker myself, the foundation of New York City and Wall Street, the slave trade into Wall Street. Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way to think about it is if you look at a map of global inequality, Africa, Black Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa is the poorest part of the world. The places where white people live, right? The West is the richest, and then you have this hierarchy in between. So we literally created the political economy in the image of white supremacy. I mean, that is not an accident. That didn't just happen. That happened by design because of the history of slavery, because of the history of empire. And it was the money that was generated through slavery, through formal colonialism, through that exploitation, which allowed us to have the Industrial Revolution, which allowed us to have all this scientific explosion, etc. Which is why today, when you see that same exploitation happening, and now it's predominantly in Africa, it's about resources, stripping out the resources for far less than their worth. In Asia, it's largely about sweatshop labor. There's a reason why all the jobs went to China, etc., because you can pay them wages we would never accept here. That can't be separated from everything that went beforehand. So it's just one system. It just looks a little bit different today.
So history, you talk about this in your book, that history has sort of in history books today in the UK and parts of the United States that still fund education, there's still representation that this is sort of the past, and we've moved past this colonial history, especially in the UK, right? But was that just? I mean, legally yes, India became independent. Legally, many different parts of the planet became independent post-colonial. But in those countries, and obviously other countries, did they really? I mean, let's stick with the countries that are post-colonial, right? Were there still trade deals that were set up? Was there still, when the UK, when Britain pulled away from India, were there not contracts set up to say, okay, well, we don't own you, but guess what? We still mine here. Our companies are still mining. Is that sort of what you're talking about here?
Yeah, so when Britain leaves India, for example, or leaves Africa, and just leave. I mean, in India, kind of did just leave really quickly, and that caused massive problems. But the economic relationships are still there, right? The companies are still owned largely by the British, etc. The economic exploitation doesn't go anywhere. So what you have is you have a parliament, you have formal freedom, and India is a really good example because it's often used as this country that's one of the fastest growing economies. It's a success story. I mean, 400 million people in India live in conditions we couldn't even imagine. I mean, the levels of poverty in India are huge. We celebrate the fact that, so under Britain, famines were a big thing. Like the British didn't care. So there were famines happened all the time. Post-colonially, there's been no famine. Hasn't been one single famine in India. And you can celebrate that and say, look, there's no famine. But millions of people die in India of poverty all the time. So there's no famine, but the country's so poor because it's still economically exploited by not just Britain, but the West, that you still have the same thing anyway. So it might look different, but it's still exactly the same problem.
Why do you think that history books sort of ignore this?
Yeah, because who wants to admit that everything we currently have is based on genocide, slavery, colonialism, death of black and brown people? It's just not something you can really, you kind of have to look away, because if you look at it, then you have to change it, right? So, for instance, think about the panic the world went into over the coronavirus pandemic, which it should have done, right? We had to close down things. We had to, we're still in lockdown, still can't travel to the States, etc. But more people, far more people, 9 million people every year die from poverty. 9 million people die from hunger every single year. Almost all of those are black and brown and in the underdeveloped world. We just don't care. We literally don't care, right? And that's the scale of it. It hasn't. So when we're talking about progress and celebration, actually look at the world. There's nothing to celebrate. It's just as bad. It just, in some ways, it's worse. And this is what Malcolm X. I love Malcolm X. And Malcolm talks about the shift from the European empires to the America becomes the center of empire after the Second World War. And he says, well, what happened was the European empires, they were too brutal. They couldn't work. Like, people won't accept, and people were fighting back. So America comes in with this, he called it benevolent imperialism, where everybody's smiling, it looked like they were friends, but it's just as bad. And in fact, it's worse, because now we're not fighting back against it. We just kind of accepted that there's nothing else that can be done.
There's a complacency, which I want to get to, how it ties into the world economy and institutions today that, seem to sort of keep the economy together. But we'll get to that in a second. Because yes, I mean, my immediate thought was it was so brutal that there was no way around post-colonialism eventually at some point in society. But with that being said, the new empire in the U.S., we have been brutal. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, the global South, there were genocides. There were in Southeast Asia genocides. Of course, Vietnam. You can't ignore that. I mean, these were in some cases like Vietnam, where there was an actual pushback and at least a national and international conversation about the failures there. But there's also what happened in Jakarta, where most people don't even know about that to this day. If it hadn't been for a book that came out like 2 years ago about how 2 million people were killed, because they once met with somebody who was in a union. And of course, the same thing in Guatemala and the global South and Nicaragua, et cetera. So they were brutal. But is it just because it wasn't happening? I mean, how is it that, especially because media was much more global at that stage in society, how is it that the dots didn't connect?
Yeah, so there's definitely, I definitely don't want to make it sound like I'm saying the violence is gone, because, geez, the violence is there. Afghanistan, there's a perfect example right there, right? So violence is definitely used all the time still. But the reason people don't really care now, that's not new, right? So if you think about the term genocide, even the idea of genocide, only comes into English or any other Western language after the Holocaust, right? It takes bodies we would now see as being white. Everybody was like, that's horrible, that's horrendous. But 10 million people get killed by King Leopold in Congo. We don't care about it. The biggest genocide in human history was in the Americas. Up to 65, 70 million people wiped off the face of the earth. Nobody talks about it. So this has been one of the major facets, if you like, of white supremacy, is that black and brown life just is not worth as much. It is not worth, we don't really care about it, we won't talk about it. So when that violence happens elsewhere now, that's just following a pattern that's been there for hundreds of years.
So what is it that made it so different? When Britain started to decolonize, they're whatever, when they started to decolonize, essentially, when there was this independence movement that was happening. What is it that is so different about now, where you still have these, or at least in the last century, where you still have these genocides occurring and they're covered in the press and people just don't seem to care, versus back then where, there was probably much more allegiance to the monarchy and yet they decolonized?
Yeah, but I guess they didn't decolonize because there was some moral
No.
Nobody cared then either, right?
Yeah.
I mean, decolonization happens because, one, people are fighting back, and two, they just realize this is really in their interest to decolonize. So, for instance, actually, for the UK, one of the things which always underplayed in why Britain was so happy to kind of lose its colony is because of the empire. If you're a citizen of the empire, you had right to live in the UK. So after the Second World War, that's why I live in the UK, because my family moved from Jamaica to Britain. And millions of people were moving to Britain. And they couldn't stop them because it's the empire, right? We're all British subjects, not citizens. So you can't stop us moving in. So what the British do basically is they say, well, we'll have independence. We'll make you independent. And then you can't come anymore. And then we're going to put these really harsh laws in place that says you can no longer come to the country. So the Commonwealth Immigrants Act in 1962, it starts all of the problems that Britain has with Immigration Act starts there. It is not coincidental that is the same year that Jamaica and Trinidad are made independent, because you make the countries independent, then you start the people coming. So there was no benevolent reason for independence of decolonization. They didn't really have a choice, and they worked out it was actually in their long-term interest to do, and they maintained economic exploitation anyway. So it all worked out. It all worked out really well in the end for Britain.
The economic exploitation. I mean, obviously, the economy that we live in today it survives off of extracting resources still. It's not something new. Look at what's going on in the Amazon right now. We covered that on the show today with Bolsonaro. But with that being said, you have the World Bank, you have the UN, these institutions that are supposed to stand for modern day democracy, post World War II democracy. To prevent us from kind of falling into disarray again. You're saying they are basically the same. It's a form of colonialism, neocolonialism. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice story. That's not what they're there for. This is where Malcolm says, like, basically the Europeans got trapped. They couldn't manage empire anymore, and so, like in basketball, when you get trapped, what do? You pass the ball. And they passed the ball to America, who presented, and America's interested because it's just Europe on steroids, right? It's a place where millions of Europeans went, committed the largest genocide in human history, and then created this mass kind of wealth. I mean, it was always going to happen at some point. If you think about America, that it would become the richest place, it would become the center. And if you think about something like the World Bank and the IMF, IMF was set up by America and Britain. The World Bank was set up by America and Britain. The UN was set up by America and Britain. I mean, it was set up by the two heads of white supremacy at the time. And they set it up in a way that would maintain the social order. That was the whole purpose of these institutions. And the IMF was firstly, it actually didn't do what it does now. So the IMF firstly loaned to Western countries to bring them up after the war. So Britain took an IMF loan, France had an IMF loan, and this was a way of America taking control, basically. So look, we're going to give our parents, if you like, the former empires, we're going to give you the money, we're going to support you, we're going to build you back up. And after that happened, then the IMF starts to loan to the underdeveloped world. But if you think about, let's take somewhere like Ghana, for example, which gets its independence in 56, I think it is. But it's been underdeveloped. When Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, takes over, there's hardly any hospitals, there's hardly any schools, there's hardly any roads. There's all the same companies that owned everything before Ghana was independent are the same companies that own afterwards. All the money's been taken out. So of course Ghana falls into economic trouble, because how could it possibly manage its economy? And then it has to go cap in hand to the IMF, who give them a loan and say, all your progressive policies that you had before, they've got to go. You've got to open up your economy so that America can come in and so that Britain can come in and we can privatize everything. And that's exactly what happens. That is across the whole entire underdeveloped world, which is why you have this debt problem, this debt crisis, and they just haven't been allowed to develop. So these institutions come in saying we want to be your friend, that are actually making it worse. And that's not an accident. That really is by design.
So why do you think that so many of these countries still fall for this? I mean, it could be immediately after, post-colonial when they're in transition, or somewhere like, I'm in Greece right now. Greece is a perfect example. Greece is part of the EU. Greece has very educated population, part of Europe, yet still still stuck taking out these loans, forced to take out these loans. Puerto Rico, another beautiful example of this strategy in an actual colony, a modern day colony. People know now. We know the tool, but why is it keep happening?
Because you have a choice. Because like this, we talk about globalization like it's new. Globalization, this system was. That's what makes the West the West is globalization. Is slavery. What is globalization if not slavery? So there's all these economic things which are put into place. So you don't really have a choice. So like Greece didn't want to. I remember this. There was a whole thing we don't want to. But you got a choice because you ain't got no money. Ghana didn't want to take the loans, but what are you going to do, right? And so because of that, they end up being forced into it because they're part of the global economy. That's the big problem. It's all tilted one way, and there's very little way to resist against it.
Okay, so let's throw in a couple of other factors here, which you're not necessarily focused on, but I think are relevant to the conversation that we're in today. You have Russia and China. China is very relevant to this, but the U.S. is super focused on old Cold War or current Cold. Whether the Cold War ever ended, in some, there's lots to be debated there. But it's about world power and world and empire, and each of these have empires of their own, built off of different financial models, but all seem to be based in some sort of resource extraction, whether it's, Russia declaring war in Crimea and about natural gas and, the turf wars between the US and Russia over natural gas, or, look to Afghanistan, China and the US, China and everybody in Afghanistan. this is sort of the modern day economy is over resources in many of these regions. But is it? I hate to use this phrase that's overused, but is the toothpaste out of the tube? How do we? If you have two other countries, world powers, and the EU, of course, that base their empires off of extraction and exploitation, how can one of these empires not? How can they decolonize without, surrendering to the other world empire?
It's a good question, right? I think this is the thing where the big debate, the big issue, in the 60s was communism, right? Got Soviet bloc, China. Have we got something different? Is it going to be different? Are we going to have something different, right? And there's a lot of violence. Lots of violence goes into from America and from Britain to quelling that. And what basically happens is they win, right? Capitalism wins. So Russia is. It's not really different. Russia relies on oil and resort and selling into the West. It's not.
And oligarchs and
China is also the same, right? Yeah. China's economic development has basically happened since they joined the West and gave up and said, "Look, we'll just do. We'll basically follow your exactly the same model. We'll oppress 400 million of our own people to make sure we can build everything." But it really is. There is no. They are really, in some ways, Russia, China, US, EU. They're probably the equivalent of Britain, France, Germany, Spain in the old system, where they all basically agree on the principles of it. It's just how do you divide it and carve it up. The problem you have there is, there's only, like you said, resources are finite, and this leads to war, right? When we saw what happened, one of the things that ended the old empire was the Second World War. They just wanted to compete. And unfortunately, if you go forward 50 years, 60 years, there's a good chance you end up in that same place, right? Because they're all fighting over very limited and also decreasing resources as well.
So, with this being said, how can capitalism be defeated? How can we, as a movement, as leftists, as workers, as anybody who has the ability to organize, wherever you live, if you have the ability to do so, what can you do? You're stuck in a system. You critique Marx in this, and I think it's very smart because this isn't the Paris Commune, which didn't go so well either. Okay, great. Capitalism falls in the U.S. Now, how do you do in China and Russia?
It's difficult. One of the things is, going back to the earlier question about why people still just carry on doing things, is the way that we are schooled into thinking about things, right? So colonialism was never just about hard power, about violence. The more insidious part of it was the soft power. It was the religion, the brainwashing, the education, the schooling, and still today, that is what happens. So these ideas are fringe. If you go to most schools, universities, colleges, you're not learning this. You're learning the kind of standard rote Western imperialism. I always say to any student on the developed world, the worst thing you can do is come and study international development in the West, because you're literally just learning how to damage your economy. That's the purpose of it. So the first thing we have to do is education is massively important. Actually peeling the scales from our eyes, understanding what the scale of the problem is, understanding that you cannot reform capitalism. Everything that we talked about, those 9 million people dying every year from hunger, that's not an example of the system not working. That's the logic of the system. That's what it's supposed to do. We have to do something completely different. And that takes that kind of revolutionary imagination. I mean, in terms of, look, the book I just wrote, The New Age of Empire, is a prequel, really, to Back to Black, which was about Black radical politics. In terms of Black radicalism, there is a pretty clear blueprint, which is unification of Africa, the African diaspora, a kind of what we call revolutionary Pan-Africanism, where you essentially take Africa out of the world system because Africa has all the resources it needs, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's a long-term project, don't get me wrong. But, if you could do something like that, that would bring capitalism down. Capitalism needs to exploit Africa. So I would say, I have a Black radical solution. Outside of that, I don't know. I just say, look, it's bad, and we have to understand it's really bad. And bad for all of us, because the truth is, capitalism is going to kill us all. If you actually look at global warming, it is going to kill us all if we don't stop. So hopefully people will wake up and realize, right?
Well, and that's what's so beautiful about so many indigenous communities coming together in the Amazon, for instance, and fighting, or people at pipelines, water protectors on pipelines, or folks blowing up pipelines. I mean, there's just so much at stake, survival. And you can actually, transform the debate. Joe Biden was moved to retract the Keystone XL. More and more of that can happen. And those, it's capitalism. So if it happens in the US, the oil and gas market can also be affected with Russia as well. If everybody in the EU goes off of, as they've said, that it goes off of natural gas, that affects Russia. And so, these little things do make a difference. And I think it's really powerful.
Yeah. And I think I would always say organize is the key thing, and all have to think about it as a long-term thing. And I think sometimes with activism, we think, well, what can I do tomorrow? What can I do next? That's not how it works, right? I'm talking about like revolutionary Pan-Africanism. That's a 50-year plan. That is a long plan. And sometimes what's been done and the way that we think about change, etc., is we kind of miss that, the big picture, the long-term plan, etc. But I always think about Europe. The European Union is a perfect example of somewhere where you have to give white people, I don't know, you call it credit, for just having a really good imagination and planning really far ahead. When the EU is dreamed up after the Second World War. I mean, imagine that. They've killed millions of people. Germany's like the complete enemy of everybody. And people sit down and say, in a few years' time, if we organize, we have this European Union. I mean, it's really, if you explain that to the average European person, they'd call you crazy. But guess where we are now? We've not just peace across Europe, massive economic bloc. Germany, of all people, is the leader of the whole thing. So with a bit of imagination and a bit of planning, believe me, anything is possible. If that's possible, then African unity has to be possible, because the problems aren't that bad. I wouldn't have thought.
What's amazing about it is, of all people, of all folks to be able to be defiant to Germany, it's the UK. It couldn't be Greece. It couldn't, it had to be the UK, which you know too well. Really fascinating conversation. Great book. You can go check out the New Age of Empire from Bold Type Books. That's where you can go check it out. We have it in our information section, so you could check it out there. Just click on the link. Really, just fascinating. Kind of flipping the narrative on this. Caiendi Andrews, really grateful to have you on today. Thank you.
Of course, thank you.
Hello, welcome to the Nomiki Show. As you know, if you've been tuning in this week, I am on break. Right now, I'm on break. I'm probably sleeping. I'm not going to lie. I'm probably just napping. I would love to say it was more exciting. That's probably what I'm doing. It's just catching up on my sleep. But luckily we have great folks who've decided to have conversations with us early on. So we keep the information flowing when I'm off. Ryan Grimm, friend of the show, friend of the movement and everything. He is the DC bureau chief at The Intercept and the author of We've Got People. Go check it out. As I said earlier, I'm coming out with another book to compete with yours called We've Got the Platforms, We're Silencing You People.
There
which
you go.
is sort of the endless conversation on the show. Ryan, okay, you've got this piece out in The Intercept, which caught my eye, and I think it was while there were so many hot takes, rightfully so, on the administration's pullout from Afghanistan. I really loved that you kind of went back to the conversations that were taking place during the Obama administration when Joe Biden did have a different take. Former chair of the Foreign Services Committee. It's not like he was completely blind, and we like to mock his blood, yes, exactly. But it's not like he's a complete idiot when it comes to foreign policy. So this piece is out in The Intercept. It's titled "Biden's Basic Question in a 2009 White House Meeting Exposed the Folly of the Afghanistan War." All right, let's go back to the afternoon of October 9th, where this story started. But actually, before we get to, where did you get this from?
So I have a strange habit of reading all of Bob Woodward's books.
Oh, poor you.
they are, I've always thought if I wanted to do a completely different career, what would be so fun would be just to wait till Bob Woodward's books come out, take everything in the book and then rewrite it in a way that is interesting, readable, and has the proper context and politics behind it, because the stuff that he gets is incredible.
Yeah. He's really good at getting people to fess up and share stories.
The slogan, the saying in Washington is, "If Bob Woodward listens, people speak," because he is the historian for the elite in DC. And so everyone's talking to him. And if you're not talking to him, all of your rivals are talking to him, and you're going to be the GOAT not in a good way in the book. So everybody gives him notes, tape recordings, documents, and sits down for as long as he will sit there with his tape recorder running. But then he just barfs it out into a book, because he turns them around so fast. He's a terrible writer. He's a terrible writer of sentences, and he's not a good writer of narrative.
You're right, though. I just love that you're so.
But they're chock full of information that has never gotten out before. And you can't just rely on the one Washington Post excerpt that he does, or the couple nuggets that get out. So I always read his books when they come out just to see what I missed. Even read the one about, he wrote one about the fight over the debt ceiling and the super committee, with Eric Cantor and Joe Biden. Actually, was a big character in that one. So this one was called Obama's Wars, and it was just about, and it came out in 2010. That's how fast he does these things.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it was all about Obama's decisions around Iraq and Afghanistan. And I had remembered in there that there was a couple of moments where Biden had been surprisingly impressive. Because, for one, he was a major cheerleader of the war in Iraq. Summer of 2002, he was holding hearings, pushing for the war. He certainly supported the war in Afghanistan, just like everybody else, other than Barbara Lee did. But in this 2009 meeting, and to back up, so it's October 9th. The morning of October 9th, Barack Obama learns that he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so then that afternoon, so then the middle of that afternoon, he's got this massive cabinet meeting with Bob Gates, Secretary of Defense, Hillary Clinton, who's then Secretary of State, Biden, Petraeus, Stanley McChrystal, Susan Rice was there, Richard Holbrooke was there, all of the important cabinet officials and top Pentagon officials and generals involved with the planning, where everybody's laying their cards on the table for what they think they ought to do. And the centerpiece of the meeting is basically McChrystal and Petraeus arguing for 40,000 more troops. And the way that they always make these arguments, they present three different options. One was 10,000, one was 40,000, and one's like 85,000. And you can always tell what the generals want because it's always the one right in the middle. And they try to give you two.
It's the same strategy. You're a father. Yes. Where you want your kid to wear something that's presentable. You say, here are your three outfits that you get to choose from today. So you can exercise your creativity.
Yeah, because you want their buy-in. Yeah.
Exactly.
They have to think that it was their idea.
Exactly. Oh my God. And of course, Obama fell for it.
Right. And so Eikenberry was also there as a former general who was at the time, the ambassador to Afghanistan. And he was actually one of the only ones that was kind of with their on Biden's side. So the question that Biden asked, which is in the headline there, is, kind of flowed out of, he started with Eikenberry. He's like, so do we have a reliable, stable governing partner in the government of Afghanistan? And Eikenberry's like, no, we don't. Like it's a den of thieves. It's just a network of criminals. And the money that we're pumping in is just actually making it worse, not better. And so then he says to Petraeus and to McChrystal, what is the value of adding troops if the government is fundamentally corrupt? And none of them have an answer to it. Like in several of the times he asked the question, there's literally no answer. And Woodward says nobody's notes include an answer. People just kind of just sat there quietly because there is no answer to that question.
Well, Secretary Clinton had a response that, and it's not like Biden and Clinton ever had similar strategies in foreign policy. They clashed. They often clash, right? But she had an answer that was it was more thoughtful in that, well, if the troops aren't there, psychologically, this could cause dysfunction, essentially. Like if you do want to have some sort of quote unquote democracy building or rebuild, get rid of the corruption, or how you do that with a reliable government or have a reliable government, there needs to be something in place to create an illusion of stability. Does that necessarily, perhaps it's peacekeeping troops and that argument is still being said today. Like even in the EU, you just have to be there so that it doesn't turn into total disarray. It doesn't mean that you have to fight, but you have to be there. Was that sort of her take? Is that kind of
sort of? So and what's funny is Woodward zeroed in on how she started her comments by saying, "Your problem in Afghanistan is, or your dilemma in Afghanistan is the use of your rather than our." People were like, "Oh, okay." So she's playing the politics of this already. So basically, what she said was, "Look, and Biden did at least force the conversation of the corruption." So she's like, "Look, you got the problem of the corrupt government that has not been built to a place that it could withstand us leaving." So her argument was basically, if we pull out now, then you guarantee everything's going to fall apart, and Taliban takes over eventually. If you put troops in, despite there not being a competent, a non-corrupt government, there's at least a chance that down the road something positive will develop. But she doesn't explain how that could be and what ought to change. So sort of what she's saying is just keep the troops in and keep things how they are. And maybe
the answer is microloans, Ryan.
Right. Yes. Microloans. And so at some point, at some point in the future, for some reason, things will get better. But what's beneath that is just kick the can down the road so that we don't suffer the political cost of withdrawing and seeing the government collapse immediately. And so that's what they ended up doing, just for 11 more years, and at the cost of tens of thousands of Afghan lives, a couple thousand American lives, and a couple $1 trillion. They just delayed a week's worth of bad news for whoever the president was.
So because it was a political decision, just to remind folks, it's not, your interpretation of it being just a week's worth of bad news. Obviously, this has impacts on people's lives. But so Biden essentially was just posing the question as to what we got out of it if we stayed there, if we put more troops in, if there was a surge. But did he have some sort of other strategy, like he did in Iraq, for instance?
His same as he's talking about today, actually. So remember, this was before we'd even killed Osama.
Right.
So his argument was just send in a bunch of like death squads to deal with whatever the official name is that we have for our death squads. You send in these covert operations and tamp down any terrorist cells that you see developing, in the same way that you would do in Somalia or elsewhere around the world. So now he calls it over the horizon capabilities, where it's like, not saying we're leaving forever, but we're not going to occupy the country. And if the U.S. wants to flex its muscle, we'll send in some helicopters and some goons and knock some heads, massacre a school full of children, and then get back in the helicopter and get back away. So it's not as if he was like hunting for the next year's Nobel Peace Prize. But that was his kind of alternative, which in Washington, it represents like the peacenik flank.
It's like empathy. Yeah. Right. No, but I mean, this is also, we all criticize drones now, but I remember the initial conversations where, well, you don't have to get boots on the ground. And it's in their minds, it was more strategic, et cetera, because Obama was so allergic to this boots on the ground concept. I mean, it's why they didn't go into Libya. The arguments made at the time with drones. I think it's just really hard to digest these conversations from the outside today, especially 10 years later or 11 years later from that conversation. For folks to really understand, like, these were the reformist conversations post-Bush. Because I want to go back to one thing. There was a moment during the Bush years where the war in Afghanistan, the early years, could have been won. And what did the Bush administration do? They decided it was one, and they decided to expand into Iraq. Was there ever any turning back after that? I mean, if Obama were to inherit this, how did it disintegrate from that point? Like, it's a big question, but you're old enough to know it.
Right. Yes. I mean, once, and so I interviewed Anand Gopal a couple weeks ago for the Intercept podcast, Deconstructed, and he talks about this exact question. He also has an article in the New Yorker this week that is tremendous, if people haven't read it, or I guess last week, called The Other Afghan Women, where he spent enormous amount of time last summer traveling around the countryside of Afghanistan, talking to women there about why it was that they were embracing is not the word for the Taliban, but welcoming the Taliban relative to the U.S. occupation. And so his thinking is like by 05 or 06, like it was over. Like we had won it by 2002 and lost it by like 2005. And because we had empowered the worst people in Afghanistan, these like gruesome warlords, we had then demanded that they provide us, with terrorists, because our objective there was to hunt down terrorists. Problem was, Al Qaeda had fled to Pakistan and Iraq. Not Iraq yet, but they would by 2003 be going to Iraq. And the Taliban had given up, put their weapons down, and gone back to their homes. And so there were no active terrorists to hunt down. And so in order to feed our demand, which was a cash demand, and a political demand, because the superiors needed numbers to punt up the chain, they just started turning people in. And so this is a country that had 20 or 30 years of war at this point. And so there are all sorts of hurt feelings and animosities that have been created over that time. And so now you have this giant power that is willing to come in and destroy your enemy or your rival, and actually wants to know who they should go in and kill and capture, send to Guantanamo or whatever. In his book, No Good Men Among the Living, he's got this one example of two rival factions who both turn each other in as Taliban, and neither were Taliban. And the U.S. goes in and massacres them both. It's like it's like tragedy on top of like travesty. Yeah. And so pretty quickly, as a result of this, the Taliban reform, and now they were thoroughly discredited among the population by 2001. They didn't have any functional ability to govern from 96 to 2001. They didn't care about governing. They weren't providing services to people. The one thing that they had done is brought a level of peace and stability, but also like misery. And so compared to what the US and its warlord allies were doing, people were like, okay, let's give the Taliban another shot. And it was a very indigenous movement. Anand talks about, by the time he started reporting on his book, was like 2008, every family that he talked to had somebody who was actively involved with the Taliban. So this idea that like you were going to win over the civilian population was gone. It was like the civilian population was actively engaged with the Taliban movement by then. And so then Obama was elected saying, if you remember, Democrats' biggest complaint was that the war in Iraq took the eye off the ball of Afghanistan, which it's not obvious that Donald Rumsfeld keeping his eye on Afghanistan would have necessarily made things better. But what it did is that it forced Obama, when he came in, because he had boxed himself in with this, I'm against Iraq, but I'm not against all wars, just dumb wars, that he felt a need to fix Afghanistan. And so then he does this crazy, like sends 40,000 more troops in, which in the book, in that meeting, he's like, wait a minute, counterinsurgency doctrine says you need one troop for every like 30 or 40 civilians. It's like, aren't we like 400,000 troops short here to the generals? Like if you're proposing counterinsurgency, you're proposing a hearts and minds winning over the countryside, everything. And they're like, yeah, it's short. So like it was designed to fail. Like even on its own, like gross terms, it was designed to fail. It was designed to just create some space where, and then he said after that, we're going to withdraw. And he announced both those things at the same time, which is always weird. And so he didn't, he did the purge. I mean, he did the surge, then he did the drawdown. By 2013, 2014, he's back to where he was when he got in, but then he didn't pull the troops out. Because now there's another election coming.
Right, exactly. When he sent, when the surge happened and he sent more troops, I think what was always very confusing to me, and maybe this is kind of where the heart of this conversation came from, was, okay, you're sending more troops to win the hearts and minds. That's the counterinsurgency strategy. But are they actually winning hearts and minds? Are they killing folks? Are they like, what are the troops doing? And simultaneously, we're 10 plus years into the war. And this is the point where we're hearing stories from Navy SEALs who were just shooting people up for shits and giggles, going out, rogue and being basically, turned in by their fellow Navy SEALs. You're hearing these horrific stories coming back from folks who've been deployed, horrific from those who were there and didn't feel comfortable doing what they're doing, and horrific, accounts from other officers in many cases doing what is clearly human rights violations. So what were they supposed to be doing if they're winning hearts and minds?
They were supposed to build up the Afghan government and build up a police force and build up a national army, and then magically it would be backfilled by a government. Like that was their theory. Not only was the latter part of that, the magical backfilling of a government theory, insane, the idea that they were going to create a stable police force and a stable army was crazy too. And Holbrooke in the meeting that Biden that Woodward writes about, he says, look, I recently went to a police training academy and checked out a police force in Helmand province, and everybody said it was a model of improvement, and that yes, it had been bad several years ago, but now you should see how it's operating wonderfully. It's like I went out there, it was just as bad as it was before. It's like he's like, I had my people do audits of the numbers of the actual numbers of police and army units. He's like, a lot of them are addicted to drugs. A lot of them simply don't show up, don't exist. Like it's just fake. The commander will claim to have somebody on the payroll, but the commander is actually keeping the money. Almost all of them are illiterate and not trained. The contractors were just pretending that they had trained people to do this. And he's like, and the attrition rate is 25%. And so he's like, look, so Stanley McChrystal says he's going to grow it to this number, 300, 400,000. It's like with an attrition rate of 25% a year, like those numbers are just mathematically impossible. And so you're confronted in this meeting with these realities that are like unavoidable. Like this is math. Like you claim you're going to do this, your recruitment numbers are this, but you didn't factor in you have a 25% attrition rate. And McChrystal just says he's absolutely right. We need to get our attrition number down. So get your attrition number down.
The people there are crooks. They're not even sure. There's no-show jobs. Or they're doing
not even there.
Like even if they, the reason maybe they're not there because they're smoking. Like what?
Yeah, and so they just in the meeting nobody responded to Holbrooke. They're like here goes Richard. Off on one of his like tangents and lectures again. So the whole thing was doomed, and it was designed to make a ton of money for contractors whose job it was to just keep Afghanistan like off the front pages. And in order to do that, and Holbrooke also pointed out, he said we're the corrupting presence there. Yeah. Good for him for saying that in the meeting. He said, we are giving money to contractors and to these Afghan units that are then paying the Taliban for protection. So the more money that we put in, the more money the Taliban is going to get.
I'm so glad you bring this up because, if you can touch on this briefly, I know it's a big subject, but, this is around the time this conversation, maybe it preceded the time ISIS started to grow, right? And it was like this. I mean, if we recall when ISIS was, it was like it was decentralized. You didn't know how to, like, no one could really figure out who was in ISIS. It was so confusing how it was structured in the early days of ISIS. And they didn't take it seriously. I remember in the beginning, the Obama administration had said something.
The JV.
Yes, yeah. The JV. That's what it was. But it ended up being a catastrophe. And how much of keeping the devil in power, whether it's Al-Qaeda, pre Osama bin Laden, or the Taliban in place was a way of, at least they're hierarchical and we have a relationship with them, whereas these guys are rogue and we don't know what the hell they're up to, not to mention the other.
Well, worse, like when the U.S. came in and Karzai became president, he immediately reached out to the Taliban. Taliban were like, we want to surrender. And some of the Taliban were like, we want positions in the government. Like, I want to be mayor of this town. And the population, like for some of them, the population wanted that. And the Taliban represented a significant, portion of the population. And so it would have been entirely reasonable and normal within the course of Afghan history to say, okay, like let's put together a government. But Rumsfeld and Bush insisted that not happen. that they be, destroyed, whatever that means. What do you do? Well, it requires genocide at that point.
Right. Which, of course, occurred. Final question, just real quick. I've been asked this multiple times this week. I imagine you have been too. If Bernie Sanders were to become president, just as an exercise here, would he have been able to do what Biden did? And granted, Biden's getting wrecked for it by his own friends and allies and his neoliberal crew. Would Bernie Sanders have been able to withdraw from Afghanistan the same way? And if so, would there have been do you think that he would have had a different model for withdrawal?
So Bernie's advantage would have been that he wouldn't have been suckered into the kind of elite status quo sentimentality around the Afghan National Army and believing that the National Army was more than it actually was. Like, he would have probably recognized that this thing is going to collapse within minutes of the U.S. withdrawing. So that could have allowed him a little bit of prior planning. But the second that you start the prior planning, then the collapse happens. So there's not a whole lot more you can do. And so the interesting question is, would the military have followed his orders?
Wow.
And I don't know. Like,
Wow.
I don't know if they would have or not. I think they could have seen it as an opportunity to say, like, look, like, we cannot, like, yeah, I know. And I think that to some degree, they deliberately botched elements of this and they certainly refused to plan in a way that would have prepared them better.
That is great. Yeah.
And I think the refusal to prepare was deliberate in an attempt to box in the civilian leadership, which is what, the military does this all the time. They try to, like, position, they're not going to disobey the civilian leadership, not going to order them around, but they're going to try to put them into a situation where their civilian leadership has only one choice.
Yeah.
And so I think they would have done everything they could to Bernie to get him in a place where he didn't have an option of actually getting all of the troops out. So in some ways, Biden, and because of his credibility with the government, with the country, because he's Joe Biden, he's this foreign affairs chair, and blah blah, was able maybe to pull it off in a way that would have been harder for somebody like Bernie to pull off. Try to imagine Elizabeth Warren pulling it off. Like, I
mean, the same could be said about the infrastructure bill. He could barely get the infrastructure bill through. Can you imagine Bernie Sanders doing this? This is
yeah, and I think it shows that any progressive agenda is going to face, like, in torrential headwinds. And if he can withdraw from Afghanistan, get through this reconciliation package, and actually deliver this stuff, I think he could go down in history as, like, a president that 20 years from now, if we're not all underwater, like, everybody is like, that was great. Like, everybody in the media, all the historians, everybody agrees, like, that was incredible.
Right.
Yet at the time, the media will treat him like, just the absolute, worst president in the history of the world. Like, I think any president trying to push through a significant agenda like that is going to get just absolutely savaged.
Yeah. Well, it's all his fault. That's what the new UFC spokesperson, Donald Trump, likes to say. Ryan Grim, awesome conversation. Thank you. Always.
Thank you.
Always always a pleasure.
Hope you're having fun on vacation.
Well, that's, in the future, me says yes. Today, me, not so much. Thank you, Ryan. Take care.
Later.
Hello. Welcome to the Nomiki Show. As many of you know, we are on break. But you know what? we have to feed the algorithms. We have to feed your brain. So we have decided to do all these wonderful pre-tapes with extraordinary guests like Matt Bruenig, who is here. Matt Bruenig is the founder president of the People's Policy Project, which has been around since 2017. Its primary mission is to publish ideas and analyses that assist in the development of an economic system that serves the many, not the few. And unlike most think tanks that are, financed by major corporations, which have an agenda, obviously, they are funded by small dollar donations. And Matt has a piece out in Jacobin right now titled 35 Million Americans Are Losing Unemployment Today. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, 35 million Americans are losing unemployment today. Before we even get to that number, the economy is out of control right now. I think we're all aware. We may not even have a good sense of it because of eviction moratoriums and so many other factors. But how many people, is there a sense of how many people didn't qualify for unemployment that could have if the taxes had been based on, last year's taxes during the pandemic or no taxes, or other factors that bar people from getting unemployment?
It's kind of hard to say. You get a lot of anecdotal reports of a lot of people not being able to sign up for administrative reasons. The state agencies are not prepared to handle this kind of load. And so a lot of people were denied or just put on kind of hold forever and ever and ever. And then you have a lot of people who they're not eligible under the rules, but maybe they ought to be. So people who just newly joined the labor force, they graduated straight into the pandemic, they would never be eligible for unemployment benefits. But in a very real sense, they're unemployed in the same way. They can't find work for similar reasons. So, it's definitely in the millions and millions of people who are looking for work right now, but not on benefits and who never received any benefits.
What do the benefits look like right now?
Right now, so we're talking about post-expiration. So right now, they've gone back to normal. So it depends on your state. Most states, the benefits, if you lose your job, you got about 13 to 26 weeks of unemployment benefits. Mm-hmm. And the amount of unemployment you receive depends on what you used to earn. And it tends to be around maybe 40% of what you used to earn if you earn like a median amount. If you earn more than that, then it drops below that level. And you're not eligible under the now normal rules, which we've gone back to. You're not eligible if you were a freelance worker, a self-employed worker, a gig worker, like an Uber driver. All that eligibility, which temporarily they were eligible, all that's gone away again. So
interesting. Okay, so this is anticipated. The economy, we have another variant, potentially more lockdowns. I mean, we know where we are right now. What is being done? Who are our saviors right now, and what are they doing to fight for an extension or fixing some of these issues that were brought up last year when we went into lockdown, but it seems like no one's really done anything to address them.
Yeah, I mean there are no saviors, I guess, on this one. I mean it's dead, and it seems like it's going to be dead. The unemployment benefits, they were beefed up in March of last year in the CARES Act, and they kept being extended and extended and extended. And the last time they were extended was March of this year, scheduled to end on September 6th of this year. Had a lot of time in the interim there to look at things and say, hey, the economy's still not doing well. We're still over 5 million jobs lost relative to before the pandemic. We still, you could look at all the problems and still say, hey, all right, we need to get ahead of this and do something. And there was just an affirmative decision made not to do that. Joe Biden sent a letter to Congress saying that he thought it was appropriate to let the benefits lapse. Jen Psaki was asked about it, and she said that, the president thinks it makes sense to get rid of them at this point. And for that reason, also a lot of members of Congress, I mean, they wouldn't be able to get it passed anyways because he might veto it, but they're kind of mum on it. People who probably secretly, deep down want to do something, they've decided it doesn't make sense to go up against Biden and start trashing, what he's doing. So
what is the justification? I mean, I don't understand. Is this politics? Like he just wants to win, one package. I don't really understand how,
he seems to have been genuinely convinced at some point in the summer that these unemployment benefits were holding things back, that they were keeping people from taking jobs and stuff like that. And like at the town hall, he was asked about this from a business owner, and he kind of, he gave into that idea, but he said, hey, they'll be over soon. That was sort of the message he gave. He seems to personally believe that. And it's unfortunate because we kind of had an experiment in whether this is true or not, because starting in early June, about half the states in the country already got rid of the benefits. It was the GOP-controlled states, and employment did not grow any faster in those states than it grew in the states that retained the benefits. No increase whatsoever. And so we had a kind of perfect experiment, like you couldn't run it any better. Half of them are treated with the cuts, half of them not treated with the cuts. What happened? Oh, no difference. And that, I don't know why that didn't shake his confidence at all. It may also be, to really get this done, you would have to do it through reconciliation if you're not willing to get rid of the filibuster, which all about all that. And so do they want to put that in the reconciliation? If they put that in the reconciliation, they would have to get rid of something else because they've already determined a dollar figure for the reconciliation. And so, at this point, I don't know, they seem to have been backed into a wall. And also partially Biden seems to really believe that, people are just kind of sitting lazy on the dole to some extent.
It was almost like you had a press shop out there pushing out this myth on behalf of McDonald's and, all these, even Uber or whatever, that they can't keep people working because of unemployment benefits. What was the counter? There was a counter point made. You didn't hear it.
Yeah. Yeah, there were so many reports of labor shortages, and then in some of the public statistics, their employers were also saying they had a lot of job openings, and so it would almost be reasonable at some point to go, I don't know, who knows, maybe it is holding it back. I don't know, it's a pandemic, it's weird, no one knows, we don't have anything to really base this on in the past. But then it was tried. That's the key thing. Half the states tried it and it didn't work. So whatever else you think is going on about why maybe there aren't that many job openings, maybe people are reluctant for health reasons, maybe they can't get childcare. There could be all sorts of reasons why workers aren't matching with employers at the moment. But whatever it is, cutting the benefits didn't help, and it only made things worse, at least, for the budgets of those families.
How is this going to affect the economy in the near future? The consumer economy, let's say that.
Yeah, so spending is going to go down considerably. There was a study from a group of economists recently. Sorry, I'm pulling it up here. Yeah, here we go. Coombs et al. They had a very interesting study where they got bank account information, which is interesting. So obviously they worked with some bank who had a lot of bank accounts, and they were able to look inside the bank accounts of unemployed people and see what happens when their checks started getting cut. And they found that for those families, their spending declined by about $145 per week, which that is, if you annualize that, it's about $7,500 a year. So that's maybe an easier kind of number to think about, is as if, your family just cut $7,500 of spending, like on an annual basis. And you multiply that across 9.3 million families that have an unemployed worker in them. We're starting to talk about billions and billions of dollars of consumer spending being wiped out, each month. So, in a very real sense, it's a form of austerity, right? Like consumer spending is going down, incomes are going down, and if you think the economy maybe could use a jolt, that's the opposite of what you want.
So simultaneously, we're having these conversations about the eviction moratorium, extending the eviction moratorium, which is, okay, an important conversation to have, but it's not canceling rent. There's going to come a day where, just like unemployment benefits, folks are going to say, state governments are going to say, no more no more moratorium. Now you have to pay a backlog of potentially 15 months, 16 months, 18 months, however long this goes, of rent. And if you're in a major city, if you have student loans that you can't get out of, if you don't have unemployment benefits, maybe you're back to work, maybe you're not, maybe you're still at home because your kids are whatever. I mean, this is the pandemic we're living in. It just doesn't seem like the government's actually, other than passing these, little acts here and there, is actually doing anything. I mean, between unemployment benefits and what is eventually going to be a major crisis in housing that already did exist, but it's going to be compounded. What is, you as just like an expert, this is what you work on. Are we like in denial? What the F is going on?
I mean, the timing of it all, the politics of it all, the relief that came, the last jolt of relief came in March, and the pandemic seemed to be winding down. And in the summer, it got lower and lower and lower. And so everything was pretty much scheduled to go away around Labor Day. And I think it was scheduled for that time period because that's when school starts. And so there was some notion that, whatever might be holding parents back, at least a lot of them could put their kids back in school. And so everything kind of got timed based on that assumption that we were past the peak. Everyone's getting vaccinated. It might be a long tail, but we're past the bad part. And then just because of the way the processes and the mechanics of the federal government work, we can't pass anything except through reconciliation, which we can only do once a year or maybe twice a year. And then we've already kind of figured out what we want to put in that. Like, it just became impossible at that point to do anything. And then, I don't know. Seems to be a lot of wish casting at this point because, of course, hospitalizations and deaths are through the roof. It's way worse now than it was when they passed the last relief bill in March. So whatever you thought about how bad it was then, they passed a big package to deal with it. And the pandemic has gotten worse in the past month or so.
And not only that, it's gotten worse in these states, these Republican states that have, as you said, they've cut unemployment benefits earlier.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that, I haven't seen anyone try to quantify that, and maybe some researchers will get to it, but it's not inconceivable, of course, that, as the benefits get cut, people get out there more, pounding the pavement, that could contribute to spread. Just like, you think about what their theory of how this is going to work is. Ideally, is you move these 9.3 million people off of unemployment, and then they go out and they quickly find work. And it's like, is that really what we're trying to do at this moment? Push 9.3 million people into, I don't know, mostly service sector jobs, because those are the sectors that are complaining the most and claim to have the most job openings, and then have face-to-face interactions with people when we have this highly contagious Delta variant. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, but it just seems like they feel like they're stuck because this is how they scheduled it based on other information they were operating off of. And now they don't have any mechanisms to undo it. I mean, of course they always do. They just get rid of the filibuster, pass a bill, but they follow these own self-imposed impediments and, feel like they're helpless.
You have to respect the laws of the Senate, the rules of the Senate. You have to respect them.
Right. Well, one of the rules of the Senate is that you can change the rules of the Senate.
What?
Yeah.
Listen, the parliamentarian is a very, very important person that none of us elected, but we all respect and admire to facilitate these white supremacist rules. Matt, thanks for joining us. Dreadful, scary.
Yeah, it is worrisome. I will see how it turns out. I don't think it's going to be good when the numbers come in. So
I'm still not giving up living off the land and having a goat. That's where I was at the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm starting to think that still might be where I'm going with this. If the land isn't like on fire or underwater,
or drought.
Yes, let's list all the different things.
All right.
Thanks, Matt. Matt Bruenig. Thanks for joining us.
The Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.